So we are gathered here this evening to celebrate the launch of One Man's Ireland, Memoirs of Dan Mulvihill, Maverick Republican, written by local historian Owen O'Shea. Dan Mulvihill's memoirs provide a unique insight into the life and times of a man who left an indelible mark on our local history. Dan's history is our history, and is a testament to his unwavering commitment to the Republican cause, his deep love for Ireland, and his resilience in the face of adversity. I have had the pleasure of reading the book myself over the last week, and what really stands out is how Owen brings Dan's life to life. His youth growing up in Brackhill, the important influence of his mother Nora, his joining the Milltown volunteers, the arrival of the Black and Tans in Kerry, and the resultant escalating violence. The book also gives a fascinating insight into the vital role of Cumann na mBan, often overlooked by subsequent historians and official Ireland. The local safe houses, the numerous raids and arrests, and the major ambushes that Dan was involved in. So, as we begin tonight's programme, allow me to extend a warm welcome to our special guests, including the Mulvihill family, who have joined us here this evening, Stephen Ray, who will formally launch the book, and Conor Graham, who's back in the corner, who Managing Director of Merrion Press. We will kick off proceedings this evening with a song that held significant relevance for Dan Mulvihill, On Shan Van Vocht. This song, a poignant reminder of the 1798 rebellion and the arrival of the French to support the Irish cause, was dear to Dan's heart. And it is fitting that we honour his memory with this beautiful rendition. Please join me in welcoming Michael Quirk and Thomas O'Sullivan on the Bowron to perform On Shan Van Vocht.
Thanks, John. No, the French are on the seas, is the Shan Van Vocht. The French are on the seas, is the Shan Van Vocht. Oh, the French are on the bay, they'll be here without delay. And hurrah for liberty, says the Shan Van Vocht. And their camp it shall be where, says the Shan Van Vocht. Their camp it shall be where, says the Shan Van Vocht. In the Curragh of Kildare, they will soon be all be there. All for liberty, says the Shan Van Vocht. And what will the women do, says the Shan Van Vocht. What will the yeomen do, says the Shan Van Vocht. What will the yeomen do, but be loyal, true and true. And we'll all will true we do to the Shan Van Vocht. Will Ireland then be free, says the Shan Van Vocht. Will Ireland still be free, says the Shan Van Vocht. Yes, all Ireland will be free, and we'll all be true we see. For liberty, says the Shan Van Vocht.
Thank you, Michael. So, to launch the book this evening, we have a very special guest who has travelled from Dublin to be with us tonight. I say Dublin, but of course Stephen Ray is first and foremost a Kerry man. A native of Mulvihill, Castlemaine, Stephen is best known as a journalist and newspaper editor of national prominence. He began his career in journalism with the Evening Herald, where he became editor in 2005. In 2012, he was appointed editor of the Irish Independent, Ireland's biggest selling newspaper, and later became group editor-in-chief of Independent News and Media. Stephen is now chair of the international consultancy firm KOBN, of which he is a founder, and which provides trusted insight and advice on corporate reputation and risk to a range of clients. Tonight, however, Stephen Ray is here as a son of Kerry, and also as a relation of Dan Mulvihill. Dan was his grandfather's first cousin. Stephen is also here, very appropriately, as a grandson of Stephen Ray, who was a senior figure in the IRA in Kiel during the War of Independence and the Civil War. Stephen Ray Sr. and Dan Mulvihill were brothers in arms during that period. The Ray family, including Stephen's great-grandfather, William Emperor Ray, were strong Republicans, and their hotel in Mulvihill, now the Anvil Bar, was a safe house and meeting place for volunteers for many years. More importantly, Stephen is also here tonight because he recorded an interview with Dan Mulvihill shortly before Dan's death in 1985. That tape recording, which Stephen made available to Owen as part of his research, was made by Stephen and his father David Ray in 1984 at Dan's home at Brackhill. So to tell us more and to formally launch One Man's Ireland, please welcome Stephen Ray.
Thank you very much indeed, and what an opening. Members of the Mulvihill family, honoured guests, Minister Foley, Minister Healy-Rae, MEP Kelly, and Councillor Griffin. Hello everybody, it's great to be back in Milltown and an honour to be asked to launch this compelling memoir, One Man's Ireland, the Memoirs of Dan Mulvihill. As I drove down from Dublin today, it was not great driving conditions. It was raining, and it was a testing drive. It was testing drive in all the rain. As soon as we crossed the mountains towards Castlemaine, the main valley was drenched in sunshine. I thought to myself, we're back in God's own country, and this will be a good night. I must give a shout out to my good friend Pat Keeney, who drove down with me, and who Owen and I recently met in Dublin. Pat, as I pointed out to the former president of the GA just now, is a rare species. We've all heard of dual stars who've played county hurling, county football. Pat's a tri-star. County football, county hurling, and international rules. So I'll let you guess for yourselves which county. Nonetheless, we're here to recognise the launch of the book and the life of Dan Mulvihill. Dan, of course, was a great friend of my grandfather, Steve Ray, and of my dad, David, who's doing well as he hopes to celebrate his 92nd birthday in June. Of course, Milltown holds a special place in my life. It was here at the Presentation Secondary School, just across the road, that I learned many of the skills that would assist me in my professional life. My memories are of well-meaning teachers who wanted the best for their students. I read only a few weeks ago of the death of former principal Sister Canisius. I also recall with fondness on being appointed editor of the Irish Independent, receiving a lovely letter from a teacher called Brother Dennis. I thought surely some mistake, as I didn't recall a Brother Dennis. Of course, when I read through the letter, the brother said I would recall him as Brother Bertrand, who was our maths and chemistry teacher. Two subjects at which I did not excel, it has to be said. Of course, it was here too that I learned lifelong skills at 3rd Kerry Milltown Boy Scouts, rising to the dizzying heights of group patrol leader. Annual camps led by local teacher Gabriel Gallagher taught us self-reliance, also taught us to cook, clean, and brought us to the mountains and valleys of this great county and beyond. In 1984, I had reluctantly returned to Milltown to repeat my Leaving Cert, having not achieved enough points for my desired course. Gladly, within days of returning, there was one of these serendipitous moments in life when I received a telegram to say I had been accepted into journalism school in Rathmines. Truly a life-changing moment, and I never looked back. This too was the genesis for my dad to inveigle this 17-year-old, totally unskilled journalism student to interview on tape the surviving local members of the IRA in Castlemaine and Milltown. Of course, the tapes reveal my dad was the real interviewer, and I very much took a backseat role. As a youngster growing up in Keele, Dan was a regular part of our lives. I remember the visits to Brackhill, Katie sitting in the corner chair, being served rhubarb pie, and of course, exciting talk of Dan having a gun. To us, the back garden was truly amazing, covered in exotic bamboo. Dan, of course, was a comrade in arms of my grandfather Steve, and they would remain lifelong friends. Steve Ray was the last IRA prisoner released from Cork jail. He, along with Timcat Coogan's father, were released together on the signing of the treaty. Steve had been jailed after the Ballymacandee ambush, after allegedly being seen spiriting a rifle from the scene. I think his time in Cork jail was traumatic, as he heard other comrades being executed and waited his turn. Luckily, the treaty afforded him a reprieve. My dad stayed in regular contact with Dan, and as I say, we visited many times. When my parents moved to Galway some years ago, my dad entrusted me with a typed copy of Dan's Memoirs. So it was indeed synchronicity when Owen contacted me about his book. on the Mallymacandy ambush, and we were able to swap stories about Dan. Dan was also a first cousin of Jack Horn, my grandfather on my mother's side, and it's great to see my uncle John Horn here from Currans. John Horn, John's dad from Currans, also played a role in the War of Independence and would end up on the other side of the treaty campaign. Unlike Dan, John Horn was no fan of De Valera, and I've had biting memories of his thoughts of Dev and economic war. Enough said. So it was indeed so interesting to read in this book about the Black Mulvihills, my mother's relations from North Kerry, of whom she speaks fondly and who feature prominently in the book. Indeed, I now know where my mom derives much of her resilience, as the Black Mulvihills were indeed a formidable family. You need to read the book to find out the whole story. This book serves an important role in highlighting the ferocity of the War of Independence in this area. It's a story of no quarter given and none expected. It's a story of combat where the protagonists fought at very close quarters, something which must have had a terrible effect on them in the years that followed. Core to the book is the critical role Dan played as a senior leader of the IRA in this area, and the country as a whole, and the county as a whole, and which would later grant him legendary status throughout the country. He was trusted implicitly by the leadership. Dan was an ideologue and uncompromising. In today's corporate parlance, he was mission-driven and impact-driven. One Man's Ireland captures effectively the horrors of war. The book also reflects a man who met the moment and excelled in leadership. Only a man of Dan's skill and trust by his cadre could have also effectively carried out his almost impossible task as liaison officer during the truce. The book works well as it also forces us to confront our own history and histories. There's much here, too, which many of us will not agree. For example, Dan's views of Collins are typically anti-treaty and fail to recognize Collins's strategic and tactical genius. But it's also a story of hope and lost promise, a story of mission-driven comrades and those who betrayed them. We learn of Dan's hopes of playing for Kerry, scuppered by an injury sustained in prison, how he faced almost certain death in an ambush during the Civil War, but how he and his colleagues surrendered in the face of overwhelming force, only to save an innocent woman and young children. Of his hunger strike in prison, of the executions of comrades, which must have had a horrendous toll. There is one chilling passage where Dan writes of his time in Ballymullen Barracks prison as the Civil War in North Kerry raged with despicable tit-for-tat reprisals. Dan writes, "One night I was in the cell talking with Jimmy Daly until about 1 a.m. Then went back to my cell. I was awakened by the sound of firing. Jimmy was dead. It could have been me." Such a powerful moment. There are many other insights. Of that jewel in the crown in this region, the Great Southern Hotel in Killarney, and despite my many times there, I had never known it was both a military garrison and jail in the War of Independence, the Truce, and the Civil War. I too had never heard of the secretive Supplementary Intelligence Service, or SIS, in which Dan served during the Second World War, and which supplied intelligence to Army headquarters, mainly, and again this was surprising to me, in anticipation of an invasion by Britain, not by Germany. We learn of the German envoy holidaying in Waterville. Other names that were common in our home as a child also come back, such as Chub Connor, another great friend of my father. Ultimately, this is a book of one man and the difficult decisions he faced head-on, of a man who played his role driven by his ideals. It's a story of the human condition, of war and an imperfect peace. It's a story of comradeship. The later passages reflect a country of immigration, poverty and recession, a country which now thoroughly only lives in memory. It's also a story of how Dan took it upon himself to ensure all comrades received their pensions and his battle with bureaucracy. plus ça change. Dan also bore first-hand witness to one of the most pivotal moments which saved Ireland from involvement in World War II, the handover of Spike Island. He was invited as a personal guest of Eamon de Valera. In today's world, as geopolitics are predominant, Ireland once again faces one of those choices, whether to stay neutral or get involved. And again, that's not for me to say, but it shows how some things don't ever change. This book is a compelling read, which moves along at the pace of a thriller. I commend One Man's Ireland to you. The book also stands testimony to the courage and valour of those from this area who sacrificed so much for Irish freedom in the War of Independence. One of the great books of this period was Ernie O'Malley's The Men Will Follow You. Well, in the War of Independence, they certainly followed Dan. I wish to thank Owen O'Shea for bringing this story to life, and thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Stephen, for those fascinating insights. Earlier, we heard one of the songs which Dan Mulvihill referred to in his memoir. Another piece which he quotes from is the well-known poem Misha Era, or I Am Ireland. It was written by one of Dan Mulvihill's heroes, Pádraig Pearse, in 1912, and was later the inspiration for the musical score of the same name, which was written by Sean O'Riordan. Here to present Misha Era in tribute to Dan Mulvihill is Louise Wren, who appropriately enough played the role of Kate Mulvihill in the play Ballymacandie. Louise is joined by Thomas, who will provide the music.
Misha Era, Sinna mé ná an Cailleach Vera, Múr ma glór mé the rug cúcolin croga, Múr ma nór ma clown féin the yiel a máthair. Múr ma fian ma naifa the réta cípa I gcónaí mé, Múr ma bhrón dig an draum an ar churas dócas, Misha Era, uigní mé ná an Cailleach Vera. I am Ireland, I am older than the hag of Bera. Great my glory, I who bore brave Cuchulainn. Great my shame, my own children that sold their mother. Great my pain, my irreconcilable enemies who harass me continually. Great my sorrow, that crowd in whom I placed my trust decayed. I am Ireland, I am lonelier than the hag of Bera.
Thank you, Louise. I would now like to introduce the man of the night and author of this compelling book, Owen O'Shea, historian and writer. Owen's meticulous research and profound understanding of Irish history has made a significant contribution to our understanding of what happened in Kerry during the War of Independence and Civil War. I would like to mention especially his two previous books, No Middle Path, The Civil War in Kerry, which captured the brutality of that tragic period in our history, and of course Ballymacandie, the story of a Kerry ambush, which, as one critic noted, is local history at its best. Owen has a gift for weaving narratives that resonate deeply with readers, bringing to life the rich tapestry of our history. His passion for storytelling will ensure that future generations can read about the sacrifices of those who fought for Irish freedom. As we delve into the pages of One Man's Ireland, we are guided by Owen's insightful and evocative prose, which captures the essence of the era and the spirit of Dan Mulvihill. Without further ado, and to share more about his journey in creating this book, please give a warm welcome to the author and historian, Owen O'Shea.
I'm really pleased to launch this book in my home place because, of course, the Ballymacandie ambush story couldn't be launched in this way because of COVID-19 5 years ago. So it's really nice. I wanted to bring this book and the launch to my home place and ensure that local people could attend and enjoy the occasion. And I suppose I really just want to talk or say a few words about how the book came about rather than tell you what's in it, because obviously you'll have to go off and read it to find out what's in it. But as Stephen mentioned, and as you all know, the story of Ballymacandie, which I published in 2021, and which became a play, which was staged here in this very hall, prompted a great deal of interest, I suppose, in the individual characters and the people who were caught up in these events. And one of those, of course, was Dan Mulvihill, who I'd heard of but knew very little about before I came to research the story of Ballymacandie. And when I was writing the book on the ambush, I learned, of course, that Mulvihill had written his own account of those events and indeed his life story. The first copy of the manuscript I received was made available to me by Niall Lucy, who's here this evening, whose grandfather, Con Lucy, was officer commanding the Cara Lake IRA, and a contemporary, of course, of Dan Mulvihill's. And Con Lucy also happens to be my wife's granduncle, Celia's granduncle, and he was a key figure in the War of Independence and the Civil War in mid-Kerry. And many of you will have known Con's son, the late Paul Lucy, Niall's dad, who had a great interest in local history and who had a copy of Mulvihill's manuscript, which finally found its way into my hands. The memoir, which runs to about 20,000 words, was of great help to me in writing the story of Ballymacandie because Dan provides so much detail about what happened on the 1st of June 1921. But after I had published Ballymacandie, I often thought that the account he wrote deserved a wider audience, and I found myself going back to it again and again. And I also found it so interesting because it covers a vast period, his whole life story really, between 1916 and 1977, which is unusual in accounts of this nature. Figures from that period have written about the period itself rather than their entire life story. So it's so interesting for that reason, because whether it's his vital role as liaison officer for Kerry during the truce, his taking part in the IRA National Conventions in Dublin in 1922, his smuggling De Valera out of Dublin at the start of the Civil War, or his many roles in later life as a spy, a pensions assessor, and an advocate for his old comrades. There are so many layers to the story. So, with the manuscript, enter Mr. Stephen Ray, who got in touch to say that he and his dad, David, had recorded an interview with Mulvihill in 1984. And better still, Stephen still had the tapes. And I'll play a short extract from one of the tapes in a minute. So, I had the manuscript, and I now found myself listening to Mulvihill rather than reading his story. Here he was talking in his kitchen in Brackhill 40 years ago, towards the end of his life. And it's one thing to read somebody's account, but it's something quite different entirely to hear someone's voice. Recordings like this and oral history generally allow us to create a more complete picture of a person, because we can listen to the way that they speak, we can listen to who they are, what they place emphasis on, what their emotions are and feelings as they describe particular events. But for me, the most revealing aspect of the Mulvihill tapes, and this is what prompted the reason we're here tonight, is that he describes in the interview with Stephen and Stephen's dad, David, how he had intended to and wanted to publish his story. He had spent some time in the late 1970s typing up the manuscript on his typewriter in Brackhill, and as you'll hear in a minute, had tried to get the story published. But alas, it was not to be, and a year after the interview in 1984, Mulvihill passed away in January 1985, his ambition to tell his story unfulfilled. So that's why I feel so very honoured, really, to be publishing this account and helping to realise that ambition all these years later. So I want to play you a very short extract from the tape, which Stephen described earlier. It's just 3 minutes. But it's part of the interview where Dan explains his efforts to have the memoir published. In this, you'll hear him talk about Con Casey, who was an old IRA comrade and who was editor of the Kerryman for many years. And you'll hear him talk about Andy Cooney, who was a former chief of staff of the IRA, and he refers to Cooney's son. And just before you listen to it, this, bear in mind, is a 40-year-old cassette tape, so the audio isn't fantastic, which is why Celia, my wife, spent so much time putting subtitles to the transcript, which will help you to follow along. But a few things before you listen to it. I think it's very atmospheric. I hope that you'll hear the ticking of the clock in the kitchen, the television on in the background. The reluctance initially of Mulvihill to speak, because when David tries to start the interview, Mulvihill said, no, nobody's going to do an interview with me. But then, thanks to David and Stephen's persuasion, once he was coaxed along, he opened up and started to talk. Just bearing in mind, as I say, that this is, the audio isn't 100%, but if you pay attention, you'll be able to see on screen the subtitles. Here's Dan Mulvihill speaking in 1984 to David Ray.
I'll tell you, we were going to come over, and Stephen was going to do an interview with you, you know, about tracing back your youth.
Nobody does an interview with me.
Or you do an interview with him?
No, don't.
Well,
I give Stephen later on.
talk about old times or something.
I give him a copy. But the second thing I wrote, it covers some the day I left back in 1916
Oh, yeah?
to 1977.
Yeah.
It covers about, I don't know how many thousand words. There are 3 copies in America. So 3 copies in Kerry, they would not be published. I tell you what happened now. I wrote in 1975, when I was in good farm, when I was in very, I don't know, 74, 75, something you were going down. I wrote it. You said I was going good, but I stopped and I wrote it. And I finished it. Can't say I had to go to the magazine. And he wanted to publish it, but they wouldn't publish the end of it. And I didn't have a job getting it happen. He wanted to keep it, you see.
Yeah, it's the one that he didn't say it was last.
Well, no, he sent out Antigone something in it, about 6 months after. And Tony is dead, he was a doctor in America, he was a pal of mine, he was chief of staff in the 1930s. And he landed here to me with a bit of Megalon, and I tell you what was our other one. Do you remember the Bank Strike?
Yeah.
1976 or 77.
77 then, I think.
It's definitely 76, is it?
Possibly then. I'm not great for dates.
But the strike was on when he came. And they asked me whether I give him the dollar. They kept it. And last year, see, I said, I don't know about it now, I know where he was, I couldn't get it. Last August, I got a bit more. 7 years ago.
Was that the only copy you had?
The only copy I had. I lost out on that I was going to make a book of it.
As you heard Dan say in his own words, I tried to make a book of it, and thankfully that's being fulfilled so many years later. It's his expression of regret, I suppose, that he didn't manage to publish the work, and his story goes on from there on the tapes and in the memoirs. And again, I think it's lovely that we're able to hear his voice years later, and I hope that brought back memories to some of you who knew him. I'm very grateful to many of the people who are here tonight, and one of the reasons, as I said, I wanted to have the launch here in Milltown is to enable people who are descended from the members of the IRA and coming on from that period who would have been contemporaries of Dan. And for example, I'd like to welcome Nell Kelleher, whose dad, Brian O'Brien, was officer commanding the IRA in Kiel and who was one of Mulvihill's closest friends and right-hand men. And indeed, I know there are other people in the audience who have relatives and ancestors who were involved in the IRA and in Cumann na mBan. And I had a message earlier today from Dolores Lyne from Killarney, who cannot be with us sadly, but Dolores is a grandniece of Liam Lynch, the leader of the anti-treaty IRA, to whom Mulvihill was aide-de-camp for a period. I'm very grateful to the Mulvihill family for joining us tonight, and I particularly want to welcome Shane Mulvihill, Dan's grand-nephew, who had the foresight back in 1984 to hand over a number of boxes of files that belonged to Dan to the UCD archives, that a guy came along 40 years later to have a look at and discovered all of what Dan got up to between the War of Independence and the Civil War. I think it's probably the only example in the country of papers that still exist of an individual who held that critical role of liaison officer, which was essentially to keep the peace during the truce between the War of Independence and the Civil War. The first time I went to UCD to look at the papers, they handed me 2 boxes and there wasn't a whole pile in it. And then I went back when I was writing this book, and the lady in the archive said to me, hang on a minute, I'm after finding another box, and which is music to the ears of anybody who's doing research. And in it was Dan Mulvihill's passport from 1925, a picture of which I include in the book. So it's really great that not alone do we have the memoir, the tapes, the liaison officer papers, and indeed his witness statement. And when you knit that all together, it brings you the story. I want to thank a couple of people before final remarks. I'd like to thank the public representatives who are here, Minister Foley, Minister Healy-Rae, Sean Kelly MEP, and Councillor Griffin. I think all the parliaments are represented. All we're missing is somebody from the United Nations Security Council. I'd like to thank the Muintir na Tíre Hall for hosting the event, and to Deirdre and Emma for looking after refreshments, to Donal and to Tom for providing audiovisual support, to our performers, Thomas, Pat, Louise and Mike, who haven't finished yet. I also want to thank the local shops and bookshops for selling the book and for holding the book, because it's very important to support your local shop and local bookshop, who've been very good to me over the years. I'd really like to thank Stephen for travelling this evening to be with us and for launching the book, particularly given his connection to Dan and his central piece of the jigsaw that he provided by providing the tapes. I'd very much like to thank Merrion Press, and we'll hear from Conor Graham in a minute, the Managing Director. This is the 4th book I've published with Merrion Press. I'm not sure if it'll be the last yet, but anyway, we'll talk about that later. And I want to thank them for their professionalism, enthusiasm and interest in the proposals that I've made to them over the years. They're a very professional organisation to work with, and I'm very grateful to them for giving me an opportunity to publish the work that I've researched over the last couple of years. I'd also like to thank our MC this evening, John Knightley, Dr. John Knightley. If you thought I knew a lot about the history of this locality, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of what this man knows about the history of our locality. And we're really, really fortunate to have a historian and researcher of the calibre of John Knightley in our community who's so knowledgeable about the past. And I'm delighted to be working with John and others as part of a new History and Heritage Society that has been set up here in the last while. And we'll have a big announcement in the next couple of weeks about an event that's happening here in the hall at the end of April. So, as they say, watch this space. And I'd very much obviously like to thank my family, my wife Celia, and my 3 wonderful kids, Padar, Nasa and Edan, and Owen Senior as well, for their support in all of my endeavours and for allowing me to indulge my passion for history. Just a final reflection. To conclude, I'm really pleased by the reaction of the people to the book already, particularly from people who knew Dan, many of whom are here this evening, because but what's interesting is that so many people knew him but didn't know about his past and his involvement in so many of these key events. And I suppose that points to the silence among that generation. Not all of them, but the majority of them. Many of that generation didn't speak about what they went through for very obvious reasons. It was a very traumatic and difficult period, as Stephen said. But though they might have not talked about it, a lot of them did write about it. And if the decade of centenaries over the last 10 or 12 years has taught us anything, is that there are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of stories still out there, maybe locked away in shoeboxes or presses or libraries or archives that have yet to be told. And I think it's interesting that so many years on, Dan was willing, once David and Stephen probed him in that interview, he opened up and started to talk about those times. And I think as well the other value of the tapes is it highlights the value of of oral history and the importance of interviewing people while they are still alive. And Liam O'Sullivan is nodding at me there. Thanks for travelling tonight, Liam, to be with us. And that's why I keep telling young people, including my youngsters, and when I was in Faha School talking to the kids yesterday about the War of Independence and the Civil War, talk to the older generation while they're still alive. There's nobody obviously alive now from the period of the War of Independence and the Civil War, but there are the next generation are still alive, and they have memories which will be lost forever unless we record them. And every youngster now has a mobile phone with a recording app. Put it under Nana and Grandad the next time you see them. Tell us what you remember, because that'll be lost forever. This is the fourth book I've published on the revolutionary period in Kerry, and it's probably the one I'm most proud of because I've always been interested in the ordinary men and women who took up arms and got involved in the fight for Irish independence and how they were motivated to do so. And what they suffered, as Stephen mentioned, continues to shock me and shock everybody, even today, because one passage from the book springs to mind, and it's Mulvihill talking about the Civil War, when he was in jail, and what Killarney and Kerry was like under the Dublin Guard of the Free State Army in 1922-23. And he says, and I quote, "Killarney under the Dublin Guards was probably one of the most dangerous places in Ireland. Things that are being done in the north at present, the early 1980s, were practiced back then. Example, knock a fella across a table, get 4 fellas to hold his hands and legs. Another held his nostrils until he had to open his mouth to breathe. An officer was waiting and shoved a packet of red paper down his throat." End quote. Or Mulvihill's description of his 40 days on hunger strike at the end of 1923. "Suddenly the big hunger strike was ordered. I felt like a lamb to the slaughter. I was 14 stone when it started. I was 9 when it ended. I went in with a good stomach, came out with a bad one." End quote. Finally, and very finally, as Stephen mentioned earlier on, if nothing else resonates today from Dan Mulvihill's story, or stories like it, it is, I think, the preciousness and importance of democracy and our democracy here in Ireland, particularly in the modern world. Mulvihill and the men and women of a century ago fought for freedom from British subservience and fought for an Irish republic. But they also fought for the democracy that we still have today, and the right to vote and the right to elect their own public representatives. That democracy here in Ireland endures to this day, despite all its flaws and imperfections. And I'm sure if Dan Mulvihill was here tonight, he would have plenty to say to the public representatives about current political events and the state of the country. But it is a democracy nonetheless which Dan Mulvihill, throughout his life, valued greatly, and one which is under increasing pressure in a world where autocrats and dictators from Washington to Moscow are gaining the upper hand in international affairs. So perhaps the best tribute we could pay to Dan Mulvihill and Katie Mulvihill and Con Lucy and Jack Flynn and Annie Cronin and Jimmy Cronin and all their peers is to stand up for democracy, to value our right to vote, to treasure our democratic rights. Many of those men and women paid the ultimate price in achieving that democracy here in Ireland. So let us never, ever take that for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen, for that extraordinary conclusion there. Two of Dan Mulvihill's closest friends and comrades were the Allman brothers, Daniel and Patrick Allman of Rockfield, who are synonymous with the fight for Irish freedom. Daniel was killed in the Headford Junction ambush during the War of Independence, and Patrick was badly wounded during the Civil War. Dan Mulvihill participated in many ambushes with the Almonds, including an attack on the Black and Tans near Beaufort in 1920. In his memoir, Dan Mulvihill writes of his involvement in the Lispole ambush in March 1921, when news filtered through that Dan Allman had been fatally wounded at Headford Junction. Mulvihill and many of those from the Milltown Volunteer Company and wider field made it as far as Aglish Cemetery for Allman's funeral. To pay tribute to Dan Allman and to honour his close friendship and connection with Dan Mulvihill, please welcome one of our finest local singers, Pat Moriarty, who will sing The Flask of Holy Water, the ballad of Dan Allman. Over to you, Pat.
Excuse me. It's a great honour for me to be here. A little bit of a frog. I want to compliment this man on his writings. I have learned more from this man's books than I ever did when I was going to school. And the strange thing about it, he didn't have to use the rod. It's a great honour for me. I'm going to sing the ballad of Dan Allman, otherwise known as The Flask of Holy Water. Written by a man from Beaufort called Dennis Breen. And the story goes that Dan Allman's mother gave him a bottle of holy water before he went into battle. He lost his life at Headford Junction, as you heard, and so did Jim Bailey. A pleasure to be here. I'm dying, said the warrior bold, for my dear native land. I'm dying, gallant comrades, let me grasp your hero hand. Today at Headford Junction, you have proved yourselves to be a model of that fighting band who fight for liberty. A flask of holy water in my pocket you will find, the only thing I brought from home when I left them all behind. Sprinkle it on my body and my spirit shall be free, and tell the tale how Allman fell in the fight for liberty. Across the fens Jim Bailey lies, and ere the twilights fall, at heaven's gate we'll bolt awake the dread tribunal call. That truer love has no one had shall be the angel's plea. He stood beside his fellow man, he died his land to free. And still the battle does ring on, my comrade lads are true. I leave their faith and guidance now to Tommy Mac and you. I bid you ne'er to mourn the cause or praise the Allman name, till you have helped to slaze the pride a nation once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, for that beautiful rendition. One of the most important ambushes which Dan Mulvihill was involved in was an ambush of a Black and Tan patrol at Kildare Wood on the 1st of November 1920. Kildare Wood, as you know, is just outside Milltown. The attack in the early hours of that morning occurred during a few days of intense activity locally, beginning with the Hillville ambush near Killorglin, which was followed by reprisals in Milltown and Killorglin itself. The song and slow air called The Hills of Kildare is therefore perfectly appropriate for this occasion, and here to perform it is Thomas O'Sullivan. So please give a hand to Thomas.
Just introduction there, a song is a rare thing, and especially in Milltown because there's very few songs, and the song that kind of stands on its own right, it was written by the end of the middle of the 1800s by Robert Turner Huggard, and he was kind of I suppose complimenting the Hills of Kildare, which is over this way. And if you go the bypass, we call it, from Milltown to Killorglin, now you can drive over the Hills of Kildare and see Canafercy and the rest of it. So the words were kind of complimenting the landscape, I suppose, really, and the trees and the whatever. And I came across this by real, I suppose, coincident really. I got the words, this was about 40 years ago, before the Oring, from a Tom, we call Tom Rabbi Heffernan, who lived over here, and in a pencil, sheet of paper with pencil. And then I was looking for the air, and it gave me the air was Marty Foley from Cloncavorta. And he was a bad whistler, and I had no tape recorder and no mobile phone, and I had to get the air into my head until I went down home to get the piano. And whatever transpired from Marty's bad whistling and my piano, this is the air that came out, and it's a bit a derivative of Eamon and Cunnick. So this is the last quatrain there of the Kildare. Whenever I wander, I think of Kildare, where the poplar, oak, and the ash do dwell. I now bid adieu to the kingdom of Kerry, charming Kildare, forever farewell. So.
This, as you know, is the fourth book which Owen has published with Merrion Press, and they are represented this evening, that is Merrion Press, by Managing Director Conor Graham, who is now going to come on stage to say a few words. So please give a round of applause for Conor.
Thanks very much indeed, John. And my goodness, you really do know how to launch books down here in the kingdom, I have to say. It's been a wonderful evening, and you're lucky to get two speeches and a glass of warm wine above in Dublin. So, and in fact, it's a long overdue visit for me, as I regrettably didn't make it down for the previous two launches of two of Owen's previous three books. So I have to say I'm thrilled to be down here tonight, and I'm no stranger myself to this area. I've been a visitor on and off to Anaskull for almost 50 years now. Very long association with that village, with my own family from North Down. So it's great to be back in the area. And it was wonderful to meet Owen when he first approached me with his first book proposal, which I believe was 7 years ago. And we're now on book 4 out of... So 4 books in 7 years is pretty good going, I have to say, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite phenomenal, actually. And during those years, not alone was he writing books, but had another child, I believe, completed a PhD. And it's just all with huge gratitude that we here at Merrion Press have Owen as one of our authors. Merrion Press is only 15 years old, but the company Irish Academic Press is just over 50 years, so we have a very long and venerable history. In most recent years, we've become one of the top history publishers in the country. And I just have to concur with John's words on about Owen in terms of his quality as a history author. It's not just a matter of collating the facts, it's how those facts are put together, conveyed, written up, and Owen has a most wonderful prose style which elevates all of his writing above the extraordinary historical facts that have been compiled there. So it's a huge honour to have Owen as one of our authors, and I have to say, Owen, you're up there with the best of the historians this country has to offer at the minute. And as I say, 4 books in 7 years is pretty good going, and I shall look forward to a productive future, I hope. And I did. I did that already earlier, don't worry. But on behalf of everyone at Merrion Press, I have to say Owen is a model author. He is much loved in the office. He meets every deadline. He's hugely creative. He gets out there, he promotes the books, he sells them, he retails them, he does everything any publisher could possibly want in an author. So it's, on behalf of all of us, Owen, above a new bridge, a huge thank you and a massive congratulations on another stellar publication. So thank you from me. Indeed, and that's all from me this evening. And I have to say thanks for everyone coming out in such great numbers and for all the other contributors to this evening. As I say, it's wonderfully culturally rich and a real pleasure. So thanks very much from me.
Thank you, Conor. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the formalities of this evening. I hope you have all enjoyed this event and will take away a deeper appreciation of the rich history and heritage captured in Dan Mulvihill's memoirs. I would like to thank our amazing performers, Michael, Louise, and Pat, and our musician, Thomas. And finally, I'd like to thank you for being here and supporting this important launch. Books will continue to be on sale at the back of the hall afterwards and also available in bookshops throughout the country as well as in local shops here in Milltown and Castlemaine. There's also refreshments at the back if you would like to help yourselves. Before we conclude, I would like to introduce a final piece of music which will be sung by Michael Quirk. It is a song which is forever synonymous with the Irish Revolutionary period and which was the closing song from the play Ballymacandie. Please welcome Michael to sing Owen O'Shea the Vahavolya.
Thank you very much. Funnily enough, on that night, the crowd joined into all that song, so if you know this song, please sing it out and finish off a great night here in Milltown. Thanks to everyone for coming. She the vav and Berlin for a brayer crack to ve in a gee of raw is the shell of Merlock is to deal to lishna gaula Oro she the vawalia Oro she the vawalia Oro she the vawalia Anisher hooked on Taurik Ta gran yo wele taktar soila Ogle glorm le margarda Gweli fenis ni gweli spanig Is corric she the ruiger haula Oro she the vawalia Oro she the vawalia Oro she the vawalia Anisher hoktan tau Of wheelery a cart go vecken, Morabin bio in a gog shockten, Grania well agus muil a kashkik, His corric she the ruger haula, Oro she the vawalia, Oro she the vawalia, Oro she the vawalia, Anisher hoktan taure, Gormargib.